Lucas was always driven by an insatiable curiosity, an almost relentless hunger for mysteries that few would dare to explore. A paranormal investigator, he spent much of his life immersed in ghost stories and forgotten places, always searching for the truth behind the legends. For him, every rumor, every whisper about the abandoned train was not just a story to tell but an opportunity to test his courage and challenge the unknown. Lucas was not someone who was easily intimidated. He saw fear as a chance to push the limits of his own perception, to confront terror face to face. Lucas's past was marked by adventures in places most people would avoid. From old mansions to dense, dark forests, he had investigated it all, always in search of evidence of what many considered to be mere figments of the imagination. His determination, however, did not stem from a desire for fame or recognition. There was something deeper, an almost visceral need to understand what hides in the shadows. The abandoned train, with all its rumors of ghosts and tragedies, was the next challenge on his list, a place where he could finally prove, perhaps even to himself, that terror was not just a construct of the mind. When Lucas first heard about the train, it didn't take more than a few details for him to decide that he needed to explore it. The stories told by the villagers were enough to pique his interest, and soon he was planning his visit. For him, this was not just another haunted place, but the perfect setting to test his skills and courage. He knew that facing the unknown would not be easy, but the idea of discovering something that no one else had seen was simply irresistible. Lucas wasn't just looking for ghosts. He wanted to challenge the very concept of fear. Despite his confidence, there was something inside Lucas that made him uneasy when he thought about the train. Perhaps it was the isolation of the place, or the increasingly detailed accounts of those who had ventured there. Even so, he knew he couldn't back down, not now. The curiosity and desire to prove that the legends were just that, legends, drove him forward. Each step toward the train would be a step toward confronting not only the unknown but also his own insecurities, a test to see how far his courage could take him. Lucas wasn't alone on his journey. He carried with him the stories and experiences of all the places he had visited, each leaving a mark on his soul. These experiences had shaped him, turning him into someone who didn't see fear as an enemy but as an old acquaintance, a feeling he was always willing to face. As he prepared to explore the train, he couldn't help but feel a chill down his spine, a sign that what awaited him wouldn't be easy to face. Even so, the determination was stronger, and Lucas knew he had to move forward, regardless of what he might find. With the decision made, Lucas gathered everything he needed for his nighttime exploration of the abandoned train. He knew the danger was real, that the stories could be more than just fabrications. But that didn't stop him. The courage that guided him was stronger than the terror growing in his chest. Each step he took toward the train brought him closer to discovering the truth, to facing the ghosts that awaited him. But deep down, he knew this journey would be different, more intense, and more dangerous than any he had undertaken before. And that excited him, fueling his need to discover what the train held in its deadly silence. The abandoned train Lucas was about to explore carried with it a legend that, over the years, had become almost inseparable from its existence. It was said that decades ago, on a cold and foggy night, the train departed from its station as usual, but it never reached its destination. They said something terrible happened on that journey, a chaos that led everyone on board to their deaths. Some spoke of a crazed engineer who, taken by an inexplicable rage, derailed the train in a final act of desperation. Others whispered about a curse that had been cast on the train, turning it into an eternal prison for the souls of its passengers. The accounts of what happened on that fateful night varied, but they all shared a common element. The train was never the same. The villagers nearby began hearing footsteps and whispers coming from the carriages at night, even when no one was around. Those who ventured close to the train spoke of a cold presence that followed them, a terror that seeped into their bones. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures in the windows, ghosts of passengers who never reached their destination, forever trapped between life and death. The fear surrounding the train spread like wildfire, turning it into a symbol of terror and unease. As the years passed, the legend of the haunted train became a tale the villagers told their children, a story to frighten and keep everyone away from that forgotten place. But for Lucas, it was an opportunity to uncover the mystery, to explore what no one else dared. The ghost stories, the muffled screams some claimed to hear, all of it only fueled his curiosity. He knew that behind every legend, there was a truth waiting to be discovered. The abandoned train, with its air of terror and mystery, was the centerpiece of this legend, and Lucas was determined to find out what really happened inside its carriages. As frightening as the legend was, Lucas believed there could be a rational explanation for everything. Perhaps the sounds of footsteps were just the echo of the wind passing through the empty carriages, and the shadows seen in the windows, just a play of light and darkness. However, there was something in the way people spoke about the train, a genuine fear that couldn't be ignored. The terror in the eyes of those who told the story, the hesitation in their voices, all made Lucas question his own sanity for deciding to explore the place. But at the same time, it reinforced his determination. The legend of the haunted train was more than just a tale to scare. It was a puzzle that he needed to solve. Despite his confidence, Lucas couldn't help but feel a chill as he prepared to face whatever was lurking in the train. The story of the crazed engineer, the idea that the souls of the passengers still roamed the corridors, all made him question whether he was really ready for what he was about to encounter. But the desire to understand, to confront fear head-on, was stronger. Lucas knew he had to go through with it to find out what the legend of the haunted train really hid. And so, with his heart racing and his mind focused, he prepared to enter the darkness, where terror and mystery awaited him. When Lucas reached the entrance of the abandoned train, a mix of emotions coursed through his body. Fear and curiosity dueled in his mind, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. The rumors about the train, the stories he had heard in the village, all fueled his desire to enter and uncover the mysteries it held. Looking at the rusty carriages before him, he felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if the train was alive, waiting for him, ready to reveal its darkest secrets. But despite the terror that was beginning to creep into his thoughts, Lucas took a deep breath and decided to move forward. Every step toward the train was a battle between reason and the instinct of survival. Lucas knew the legends could be just that, legends, but the insecurity growing inside him as he approached the carriages was undeniable. He tried to push aside the thoughts of chaos and terror that were starting to take over his mind, reminding himself of all the explorations he had already done. This was just another challenge, another test of his courage. But deep down, he knew something was different this time. The train seemed to whisper to him, a silent call he couldn't ignore. When he finally reached the door of the first carriage, Lucas hesitated for a moment. The ghost stories and apparitions haunted his thoughts, but he couldn't allow fear to paralyze him. With renewed determination, he pushed the door open, which creaked loudly, echoing in the silent night. The air inside the carriage was heavy, cold, as if time had stopped there. Lucas felt a shiver down his spine but moved forward, convinced that he needed to face whatever was in there. The courage that had brought him this far would be his only companion in the darkness. As Lucas moved through the carriage, he couldn't help but notice how oppressive the silence was, almost deafening. Every step he took seemed to echo throughout the structure, as if the carriages themselves were alive, reacting to his presence. He knew he was entering uncharted territory, where terror could emerge at any moment. But it was precisely this adrenaline, this feeling of being on the edge, that pushed him to continue. Lucas forced himself to ignore the growing fear, focusing on the task ahead. He had made his decision to explore the train, to discover the truth no matter the cost. As he advanced through the dark corridors, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. With every step, the sense of insecurity grew, as if something or someone was lurking in the shadows. He knew it was fear talking, but that didn't make the experience any less frightening. The train seemed to envelop him in its own atmosphere of terror, playing with his senses and emotions. But Lucas stood firm, determined not to let fear overwhelm him. He had to keep going. He had to see what awaited him at the end of that journey. Lucas knew his decision to explore the train could be the last one he ever made, but the desire to confront his fears was stronger than any insecurity. He was determined to see it through, to face whatever was lurking in the abandoned carriages. The train, with all its aura of mystery and terror, had become the battlefield where Lucas would test his courage. And as he moved deeper into the darkness, he knew there was no turning back. The only way was forward, into the unknown that awaited him. The darkness of the night enveloped the abandoned train like a heavy cloak, and Lucas felt the penetrating cold as he took his first steps into the carriage. The air inside seemed different, denser, charged with an energy that made his heart race. Every movement he made was accompanied by the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors, a constant reminder that he was completely alone. Or at least so he hoped. The silent terror that hung in the air began to manifest in small things. The way the shadows moved strangely, as if something or someone was hiding within them. As Lucas explored the interior of the train, he couldn't help but notice how everything seemed untouched, as if time had stopped. The dust-covered floor and torn seats were silent witnesses to an era that had long passed. But there was something more, something he couldn't explain. Almost inaudible whispers began to invade his ears, as if the walls of the train were trying to communicate something. Lucas paused for a moment, trying to identify the source of the sounds, but all he felt was a chill that ran down his spine. He knew that fear was starting to take hold, but he needed to stay focused. The first night of exploration would be crucial. As Lucas advanced through the carriages, a growing sense of insecurity began to settle in his chest. Each door he opened seemed like a portal to the unknown, and the darkness that hid beyond them did nothing to ease his tension. At one point, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, but when he turned around, there was nothing but emptiness. That was the first of many scares he would experience that night. The terror began to manifest more intensely, as if the train itself was testing his courage. Lucas pressed on, determined, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching him. The cold inside the train intensified as the night wore on, and Lucas noticed his breath becoming visible in the air. What had once been just a legend was beginning to transform into a palpable reality, something he could feel on his skin. He knew he should be documenting every detail, but his mind was focused on something else: surviving the night. The atmosphere of terror was almost suffocating, and each step he took seemed to echo like a scream in the darkness. The train, with its shadows and whispers, was revealing itself to be a much more formidable adversary than he had imagined. At one point, Lucas found an isolated compartment where the windows were completely covered by the grime of time. Inside, the cold was even more intense, and he felt an irrational fear grow within him. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that it was just an overreaction, but then something happened. A shadow passed quickly at the corner of his vision. When he turned, there was nothing again, but the scare left his heart pounding. It was as if the train was playing with him, testing his limits. Lucas took a deep breath and decided to continue, knowing that the worst was yet to come. As the night progressed and Lucas delved deeper into the train's secrets, he realized that his initial fear was being replaced by a sense of urgency. He needed to figure out what was happening there before the terror became unbearable. But no matter how much he tried to stay calm, the insecurity only grew, and the terror of being surprised by something he couldn't see began to dominate his thoughts. Lucas knew he couldn't stop. He needed to continue the exploration, but a part of him was starting to doubt whether he would leave there the same as he had entered. As the night advanced, the environment inside the abandoned train began to change in a disturbing way. What were once distant whispers and fleeting shadows now became something more tangible, more terrifying. Lucas felt the temperature drop even more, and the air seemed to grow thicker, almost suffocating. It was as if the train was gaining a life of its own, reacting to his presence. Suddenly, he heard the sharp sound of a door slamming shut somewhere ahead of him. The noise echoed through the carriages, resounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Lucas froze for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened, but fear was beginning to take over his thoughts. As he cautiously moved forward through the dark corridors, Lucas began to notice that the paranormal phenomena were intensifying. The shadows that once seemed harmless now appeared to have form and intent. He felt as if he was being watched from all angles, as if something invisible was lurking, waiting for the right moment to attack. At one point, he heard a whisper directly in his ear, so close that he instinctively turned to see who was there. But there was no one. The terror began to settle deep within him as insecurity grew with every step he took. The light from Lucas's flashlight flickered as he continued the exploration, revealing only fragments of what was around him. Suddenly, a spectral figure crossed one of the carriages ahead of him, disappearing into the darkness before he could react. The scare was so great that he nearly dropped the flashlight. The intense cold was becoming increasingly unbearable, and Lucas felt his body tremble, not just from the cold but also from the terror that was beginning to overtake him. The train seemed to be alive, a place where chaos reigned and where the rules of the outside world no longer applied. Every step forward was a battle against the growing fear. The sounds inside the train also began to change. What was once just the echo of his footsteps now mixed with noises he couldn't identify. Murmuring voices, doors creaking on their own, the sound of footsteps that weren't his. Lucas knew he was dealing with something beyond common understanding, something that could easily drive him to madness if he didn't keep control. But the terror he felt was almost palpable, and he knew he needed to be strong, needed to continue, even though the fear was about to consume him. The ghost stories he had heard over the years now seemed frighteningly real. Lucas began to question his sanity as the paranormal events intensified. He saw objects moving on their own. A chair that slowly slid from one side of the carriage to the other. A door that opened and closed with no one nearby. The train was revealing itself to be a deadly trap, a place where the line between reality and the supernatural was dangerously thin. But he knew he couldn't allow himself to succumb to fear. Not yet. There was something in this train that he needed to discover, something that pulled him deeper and deeper into this dark chaos. Courage was his only weapon against the terror, but even that was beginning to waver. With the paranormal activity reaching its peak, Lucas realized he was in a fight for his own survival. The train, with all its ghostly manifestations, was becoming a formidable adversary, a final test of his courage and determination. He knew he needed to continue, that retreating now would be the same as surrendering to the terror that surrounded him. But with each new scare, each new manifestation of ghosts and shadows, Lucas felt he was reaching his limit. The cold, the fear, and the insecurity were beginning to erode his determination, leaving him at the mercy of the terror that inhabited that train forgotten by time. As Lucas advanced through the train, each carriage seemed to hold a fragment of a story that was clamoring to be told. He began to notice details that had previously escaped him, like old, partially burned photographs strewn in the corners, showing unknown faces and scenes from a distant time. In an isolated compartment, he found a set of old suitcases, covered in dust and with tags indicating destinations never reached. The terror surrounding the train was beginning to take shape as these pieces of evidence showed him glimpses of the dark past that had unfolded there. Lucas felt he was unearthing secrets that should have remained forgotten. In one of the oldest carriages, Lucas found something that made him stop abruptly. Amid the chaos of scattered objects, there was a diary, its pages yellowed by time but still legible. What was written there revealed a story of despair and death, of people trapped in a tragic fate from which they could not escape. The words were laden with fear, as if the author was trying to warn anyone who found the diary about the danger that lurked in the train. Every line Lucas read made his heart race, and he felt a chill run down his spine, as if the words themselves had the power to evoke the terror of that fateful day. As he explored further, Lucas found a small metal box hidden under a broken seat. Inside was an old pocket watch, stopped at what seemed to be the exact moment the train met its tragic fate. The discovery brought a mixture of terror and curiosity. He imagined the owner of that watch, perhaps a passenger who never expected that journey to be their last. The story unfolding before his eyes was more horrifying than anything he could have imagined. The train wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was steeped in the memory of a chaos that still echoed in the empty corridors. Further along, Lucas came across a wall covered with strange symbols carved into the worn wood of the carriages. They seemed ancient, laden with a meaning he couldn't fully decipher, but that conveyed a sense of imminent danger. The symbols, combined with the other artifacts he had found, told a story of a curse, of something dark that had taken hold of the train and its passengers. The insecurity Lucas felt intensified, and he began to understand that the train wasn't just a place where terrible things had happened, but where evil still resided, waiting for anyone who dared to invade its territory. Each new discovery seemed to pull Lucas deeper into the abyss of terror. The photos, the diary, the watch, and now the symbols all pointed to a past that refused to be forgotten, a past that was embedded in the walls of that train. Lucas felt the weight of history on his shoulders, as if each object was trying to tell him something, a terrible truth that he wasn't prepared to hear. But he knew he couldn't stop now, that he needed to continue, no matter how terrifying the secrets were. The train held more secrets, and Lucas was determined to uncover them, no matter how frightening they might be. As Lucas continued to explore, he couldn't help but wonder if he was really prepared to face what awaited him at the end of this journey. The dark past of the train was revealing itself in a terrifying way, and each new piece of the story seemed to bring with it a new wave of fear. But despite the insecurity and terror growing within him, Lucas knew he had to keep going. He was in the middle of something much bigger than he had anticipated, and the only way out was to face whatever was waiting for him at the heart of that abandoned train. The terror Lucas had been facing was reaching its peak, and he began to realize that perhaps he had gone too far. With each new discovery, the sense of imminent danger became more palpable, as if the train was trying to keep him there, trapped in its web of mysteries and ghosts. Determined to leave before it was too late, Lucas began to make his way back. But he soon realized that what once seemed like a simple corridor had now transformed into a dark and treacherous labyrinth. The doors that had been open before now seemed locked by an invisible force, and the growing cold did nothing to alleviate the panic that was beginning to take hold of him. Every step Lucas took toward the exit felt like a monumental effort. The train, which had once seemed like just an abandoned place, was now revealing itself as a deadly trap. The sound of footsteps echoed around him, but this time he was sure they weren't just the echo of his own. Something or someone was following his movements, watching every decision he made. The fear that was already palpable began to transform into real panic as insecurity took over his mind. Lucas tried to stay calm, but the thought of being trapped there, at the mercy of forces he didn't understand, was almost unbearable. Lucas tried to open one of the carriage doors to get out, but the handle was cold and immovable, as if it was frozen in time. He pulled hard, but the door didn't budge. Panic began to turn into desperation as he felt the terror tighten its grip on his chest. He quickly turned, determined to try another exit, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Lucas knew he was being cornered, that the train was playing with his fears and insecurities, keeping him within its dark corridors. Each new attempt to escape was frustrated by locked doors, blocked passages, as if the train itself was alive, determined not to let him go. Lucas's mind began to race with possibilities, but each one was more terrifying than the last. What if he never managed to get out? What if the train was indeed a portal to a world of chaos and terror, where he was doomed to wander for all eternity? These thoughts haunted his mind as he tried, in vain, to find a way out. The cold was becoming unbearable, each breath turning into a cloud of vapor, and Lucas felt the chill spreading through his body, as if the very essence of the train was trying to freeze him there forever. He knew he needed to keep a cool head, but the panic was beginning to take control. In a final desperate attempt, Lucas ran back to the main entrance, the point where he had entered. But when he got there, he found the door completely shut and locked, with no sign that it had been opened just a short while ago. The terror of being trapped there began to suffocate him, and Lucas pounded on the door with all his might, trying to force it open. His blows echoed throughout the train, but the door didn't give way. He knew he was running out of options, that time was running out, and that if he didn't get out soon, it might be too late. The feeling of being pulled into the train itself, as if becoming part of it, was terrifying. Lucas, now exhausted and desperate, leaned against the wall of the carriage, trying to catch his breath and his thoughts. He knew there was something there, something trying to keep him from leaving, something that didn't want him to escape with the truth he had discovered. But at the same time, he also knew he couldn't give up. He needed to find a way out, to escape this nightmare before the train completely consumed his sanity. With renewed determination, Lucas stood up, determined to try one last time. But deep down, he knew the battle was just beginning, and the true terror was yet to come. The despair that gripped Lucas was overwhelming, but he knew he couldn't give in to the terror that surrounded him. Realizing that there was nowhere else to run, he began to understand that the only way to escape would be to confront directly whatever was pursuing him. The train seemed to have a life of its own, a predator that was only waiting for the right moment to strike. Lucas felt the air around him grow denser, and the intense cold seemed to freeze his thoughts. But inside him, a spark of courage still burned, a fierce determination to survive the chaos that surrounded him. He was ready for whatever came, even if it meant facing terror incarnate. The darkness of the carriage ahead of him seemed to take shape, and Lucas saw, for the first time, the entity that was haunting the train. A nebulous, indistinct figure, but loaded with a terrifying presence, emerged from the shadows. It was as if all the fear and chaos of that place had materialized into a being that exuded pure terror. Lucas felt his heart race, his breathing become irregular, but he knew he couldn't back down. The entity advanced slowly, as if savoring the fear emanating from him. Lucas, in turn, gripped the flashlight more tightly, using it as an anchor of sanity amidst the despair. When the figure drew even closer, Lucas felt a chill that almost paralyzed him. But instead of succumbing to panic, he focused on the one thing that could give him an advantage, his desire to understand the unknown. Lucas stared at the entity, his eyes fixed on the nebulous figure, trying to decipher what exactly was before him. Amid the terror, he began to realize that it wasn't just a manifestation of fear, but something that needed to be confronted for him to survive. The confrontation between Lucas's courage and the entity's terror was inevitable, and he knew that his survival depended on facing this fear head-on. The entity, realizing that Lucas wouldn't back down, began to manifest more aggressively. The entire train seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy, as if it was preparing to swallow Lucas into an abyss of endless terror. Doors began to slam violently, and the sound of footsteps echoed throughout the carriage, as if dozens of ghosts were surrounding the protagonist. Lucas felt the pressure increase, the terror almost suffocating him, but he refused to give in. With the flashlight in hand, he took a step forward, challenging the entity, his voice trembling but firm as he murmured a silent prayer, seeking strength from the depths of his soul. The final confrontation was a whirlwind of emotions and pure terror. Lucas found himself face to face with what seemed to be the culmination of all his paranormal experiences. The entity, in all its ghostly form, was about to strike, but Lucas, driven by a mixture of fear and courage, raised the flashlight as if it were a weapon. The light, however faint, seemed to repel the shadow for a moment, giving Lucas the opening he needed. Feeling that this was his only chance, he advanced with everything he had, determined to break the cycle of terror that had kept him trapped in this nightmare. The clash between light and darkness was intense, a moment when everything seemed to resolve. When the light finally pierced through the darkness, the entity recoiled, as if it was dissolved by Lucas's courage. The train, which had previously seemed alive with a malevolent energy, began to calm down, the noises ceasing, the terror receding like a low tide. Lucas, exhausted and trembling, realized that he had survived the worst. But he knew that this victory was only temporary. The entity might have retreated, but the train still held many secrets, and Lucas needed to find a way out before the terror started again. The confrontation was over, but the danger was not completely gone. After the confrontation, Lucas knew he didn't have much time. The train, which had momentarily retreated in its hostility, was still a menacing presence, and he needed to get out of there before the terror reorganized and came after him with even greater force. With the flashlight in hand and his heart still racing uncontrollably, he began to desperately search for an exit. Every step he took seemed to echo in the darkness, as if the train was trying to follow him, and every noise intensified the feeling that he was far from safe. The courage that had sustained him until now was beginning to wear thin, replaced by a growing urgency to escape. As he ran through the carriages, Lucas noticed that the structure of the train seemed to be changing. Corridors that had previously been familiar now seemed to stretch infinitely. Doors he had locked were now open, as if the train was trying to confuse him, to keep him trapped in its labyrinth of terror. The cold intensified with every second, and Lucas felt as if time itself was freezing around him. Panic was on the verge of taking over, but a small voice in his mind urged him to keep going, not to give in to fear. He needed to stay calm, needed to focus on the only thing that could save him, finding an exit. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lucas spotted the exit door he had been searching for. The relief he felt at seeing the faint light outside was overwhelming, almost making his legs give out. But he knew he couldn't stop now. With the terror still lingering behind him, he ran toward the exit, his hurried footsteps echoing through the carriages. The fear of being caught by the entity he had faced was overpowering, but the determination to survive was stronger. He knew that if he didn't escape now, he might never have another chance. The flashlight flickered, but Lucas didn't slow down, determined to reach freedom. When he finally crossed the door, Lucas felt the cold night air envelop his body, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the train. He collapsed to his knees, exhausted and in shock, the terror still pulsing through his veins. Looking back, he saw the train, now silent, as if nothing had happened. But he knew that the terror that inhabited that place was still there, waiting for its next victim. Lucas had escaped, but the train had left a permanent mark on his soul, a reminder of the chaos and fear that he would never be able to erase. The sense of insecurity still haunted him, even now that he was outside. But what if Lucas hadn't managed to escape? The story could have ended differently, with him disappearing forever inside the train, becoming just another legend for the villagers. Perhaps they would speak of him as they spoke of others who had vanished, a warning to those curious enough to venture too close. The train would remain a dark enigma, a place where terror and chaos reigned, guarding its secrets until another brave or foolish soul decided to try their luck. Lucas knew he had barely escaped, but the memory of what he had faced inside that train would haunt him forever. When Lucas finally got up and began to walk away from the train, he knew that the experience had changed something inside him. The terror he had faced, the battle for survival, all of it had left deep scars. He had escaped with his life, but he was no longer the same person. The train had shown him a side of fear he had never known before, a terror that defied understanding and couldn't simply be left behind. Lucas had managed to flee, but the train would remain there, abandoned and forgotten, patiently waiting for the next brave or foolish soul to challenge it. As Lucas moved farther from the train, the weight of what he had just experienced began to sink in. Every step he took away from that cursed place felt heavier, as if the terror was still trying to pull him back. His thoughts were a jumble of fear and disbelief, struggling to process the reality of what had happened. The darkness of the night seemed to close in around him, but at the same time it offered a strange comfort. He was finally out of the train's reach, at least for now. Looking back one last time, Lucas could barely make out the silhouette of the train in the distance, its once menacing presence now reduced to a shadow in the night. But he knew that the horrors he had witnessed were far from over. The train, with all its dark secrets and ghostly inhabitants, would continue to exist, hidden away from the world, a place where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurred. And Lucas, though he had survived, would carry the memory of that night with him for the rest of his life. The village, with its quiet streets and familiar faces, felt a world away from the horrors of the train. Yet, as Lucas walked through the town, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the terror he had escaped was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. The stories of the haunted train, once just a collection of frightening tales, had become all too real for him. And now, he understood why the villagers spoke of it with such fear, why they warned against going near it. The train was more than just a legend. It was a living nightmare, a place where terror and death reigned. As the days passed, Lucas found it increasingly difficult to move on from what he had experienced. The memories of the train haunted his dreams, the faces of the lost souls he had glimpsed in the darkness returning to him night after night. He could still feel the cold, still hear the whispers that had echoed through the empty carriages. The line between the living and the dead, between reality and nightmare, had been irrevocably blurred for him. The village, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt alien to Lucas. Every creak, every shadow seemed to hide a new terror, a reminder of the horrors he had narrowly escaped. The people who had once been his neighbors now looked at him with a mix of curiosity and fear, as if sensing the change that had come over him. Lucas tried to return to his old life, to forget the nightmare he had lived through, but it was impossible. The train had left its mark on him, and there was no going back. Despite the terror that still gripped him, Lucas knew that he had to find a way to move forward. The train, with all its horrors, was behind him now, but the experience had changed him in ways he couldn't fully understand. He had faced the unknown and survived, but at a cost. The fear that had once driven him, that had pushed him to explore the darkest corners of the world, now held him back, a constant reminder of the thin line between life and death. As time passed, Lucas began to accept that the train would always be a part of him, a dark chapter in his life that he could never fully close. But he also knew that he couldn't let it define him. The world was still full of mysteries, still full of unknowns to explore, and despite the terror he had faced, he couldn't turn away from them. The train had shown him the depths of fear, but it had also taught him the value of courage, of facing the darkness even when every instinct told him to run. In the end, Lucas knew that he couldn't escape the shadow of the train, but he could choose how to live with it. The memories would never fade, the fear would never fully disappear, but he could find strength in the knowledge that he had survived, that he had faced the terror and come out the other side. The train would remain, a dark and terrifying place, but it no longer held power over him. Lucas had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale, and that, he realized, was something to be proud of. The villagers, for their part, never forgot what Lucas had done. His story became another legend, a tale to be told alongside the stories of the haunted train. Some said he was crazy, others called him brave, but all agreed that Lucas had done what no one else had dared to do. He had faced the terror of the train and lived to tell the tale, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. And so, the train continued to sit, abandoned and forgotten by the world, a silent monument to the terror that had claimed so many lives. But for Lucas, it was more than that. It was a reminder of the strength he had found within himself, of the courage it took to face the darkness and survive. The train, with all its horrors, was behind him now, but the lessons it had taught him would stay with him forever.